This is the fourth beast, the eagle, part 5, the George Albert Smith prophecy. So about a year ago, I came to know about this prophecy from an internet forum. The thread I came across is called the Ultimate George Albert Smith Prophecy Thread. Its main purpose is to document a vision of World War III that George Albert Smith had secretly shared to a few individuals, and I'll be leaving a link in the description below. In this video, I'll be reading through the contents of what I find to be the two most important posts from this thread. For video editing purposes, I'll first read through the entire prophecy. Then afterwards, I'll provide commentary of my thoughts about this prophecy, if it holds any merit, and its implications to Ezra's eagle. I know there is a similar thread already here, but in researching this prophecy, I found that much of the information and accounts are spread out over several threads in the internet. To make it easy to research, I've gathered together all the accounts and quotes I could find on this prophecy, and compiled them into one easy-to-find post. There are at least 3 accounts of the prophecy given by President Smith, and it is indicated that he told this to other people. He also hinted at this in General Conference a couple of times. Account 1. Source: David Horn. October 28, 1988 or December 23rd of 1988. This short account is one of 2 written by Brother David Horn in 1988. It is unclear which date this account was written, or where the other written account is. This summary is the main source as to the timing of the events in the George Albert Smith prophecy. Shortly after World War II ended, President George Albert Smith had a vision of another great and terrible war, which would yet take place. He said it would be so bad that it would make World War II look like a training exercise. It would involve many of the countries of the world, including Germany, Hungary, Israel, Turkey, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Thousands of tanks would be transported in huge trucks, so they would be in place where they were needed when the war began. The United States would have missiles in Europe which carried an atomic bomb. However, the United States would be committed to many far-reaching alliances and would withdraw its missiles to satisfy the Soviet Union. Then the war would begin and people would die like flies. The military power of the Soviet Union at this time would be much greater than the United States. He said the United States would take away the weapons of the people. They would have their missiles in big holes in the ground, which he described as being like grain silos. The Soviets would send their own missiles to try to destroy them, as well as U.S. military bases and cities. They would also send in ground troops. President Smith indicated that this attack would take place on a holiday after the presidential election, but before the official inauguration. He said that the president at this time would be of Greek ancestry. President Smith said that the conditions after the war would be dreadful and would make the worst times of the Depression seem like a Sunday school picnic in comparison. Account 2. Brother David Horn, February 28, 1989. This much longer and complete account by Brother David Horn is on file at the Harold B. Lee Library and is the main source of the George Albert Smith prophecy. It greatly expands on his earlier summary of the prophecy, but also leaves out the timing of the prophecy. David Horn, chemical engineer, 28th of February, 1989. Sometimes rare, dramatic, or shocking events become emblazoned into one's memory. This paper documents such an event. In 1946, I witnessed a prophetic utterance made by George Albert Smith, the prophet and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, from 1945 to 1951. I am a son of Dr. Lyman Merrill Horn and Myrtle Swinston Horn. My father was a great-grandson of George H. Smith, cousin of the prophet Joseph and counselor to Brigham Young. His grandson, President George Albert Smith, was Dad's mother's first cousin. From 1944 until March 1947, We lived on the same block in the Yale ward as George Albert Smith and frequently had contact with him. Many times he paused at our home while on his evening walk and talked with me as I walked in our front yard. My family visited him a few times at his home, and he visited my family at our home several times. He always showed pleasure when I met him, and once told me what work the Lord had for me to do and what I must do to be prepared to do his work. One day our father arranged for George Albert Smith to speak to us in a family time. The prophet told us of a vision he had had. At least 11 elements of it have occurred, and the rest may occur soon. My record of his prophecy may be important, because it may not be officially recorded. Last year I visited the church historian's library to read President Smith's journal to see what he had written about it, but the staff knew nothing about it. I then discussed it with Leonard Arrington, former church historian, who said, "I have never heard of it." Even Arthur Haycock, his faithful secretary, did not know of it, but he did not work with President Smith until July 1947. We dressed up in our best clothes. I shined my shoes again and again. Our father was disappointed with a sister who went to a movie with her boyfriend. Dad asked her to stay with her babe, who had finished his Navy service in August 1946, and share the evening with the Lord's prophet, but she would not. We were seated at the given time in the living room, ready for the prophet to arrive. Present were my father, mother, sister, Alice Merrill Horn II, age 17, my brother, Robert H. Horn, 14, my twin, Jonathan H. Horn, and I, age 11. It was after dark, and we had difficulty making the front porch light work. It was cold in that room, and I was glad to wear a coat. Thus I think that his visit was between October 1946 and January 1947. Thereafter we were preparing to move. President Smith said much more than what I remember exactly, but some of his statements were so impressive that I have a brilliant recollection of them. When George Albert arrived, we sang a verse of "We Thank Thee, O God, for a Prophet." He stood and talked without notes for some time in the importance of keeping the commandments, always giving a full tithe, and being a good example wherever we are. He told us he once was on a train in Mexico with no other Northern European descent individuals. He said that a man recognized him as a leader of the Mormon Church and introduced himself as a Mexican government official. President Smith noted how embarrassed he and the church would have been had he not been acting as a faithful servant of the Lord should. I also heard him tell that story in another talk. Then President Smith said, "I have a troublesome vision of another great and terrible war that made the war just ended look like a training exercise, and people died like flies. It began at a time when the Soviet Union's military might dwarfed that of the United States, and we, that is the United States, would have missiles that carried an atomic bomb in Europe. I saw the United States withdraw its missiles to appease the Soviet Union, and then the war began." He also said that we would have big missiles in deep holes he described like grain silos, which the Soviets would try to destroy by their own missiles. They would hit military installations in some cities also. He said that the president at that time would be of Greek extraction. Until then, all the presidents would be of British or Northern European ancestry. He continued that the U.S. would be bound by numerous entangling alliances and would take away weapons owned by the people. He talked some about the initial attack and the ground warfare, but I can't remember enough to document all their tactics and in which countries various things occurred. One tactic, especially in Europe, was to transport tanks and thousands of big trucks like semi-trailers on the superhighways to have them located where they wanted them when the war was to begin. During that explanation I asked, "What about the atomic cannon?" To which he answered, "I didn't see anything like that." Then he said the aftermath was dreadful. Think of the worst, most difficult times of the Depression. He turned to us children and said, "You won't remember the Depression," which was true. I didn't know there was a depression as I was growing up. The sun came up every morning, flowers bloomed, we went to school, and there was church every Sunday. But he repeated to our parents, "Think of the worst condition of the depression. Can you think of something?" To which our father answered, "Oh, yes." Then President Smith continued, "You know how Sunday school picnics are complete with salad, chicken, root beer, and dessert, and everyone has a wonderful time. The worst time of the depression will seem like a Sunday school picnic when compared with how conditions will be after that great war." When he finished speaking, he turned around and went to the front door. As I left, I thought to myself, what he said is really important. I've got to remember it. To understand President George Albert Smith's woeful statement, I have had a troublesome vision. One first must comprehend the kind of man President Smith was. Those who knew him best describe him as the most humble, compassionate, magnanimous, kind, and merciful person they knew. He exemplified the pure love of Christ and showed his love for all of God's children by his unqualified service. For example, at World War II's end, he organized a relief program for war-torn Europe's destitute people. The Relief Society sisters made quilts and clothes. The church welfare cannery produced millions of cases of food donated from farms and home gardens. Other materials and food were purchased from donations by church members worldwide. Then he obtained U.S. President Truman's permission to send the aid and assigned Elder Ezra Taft Benson to administer its distribution in Europe. The aid was not restricted to the LDS church members. The government of Greece honored President Smith for his and church service to its people. Thereafter, the government initiated the Marshall Plan, and organizations like CARE sprang up. Thus, for him to see an event of which he also said in his April 1950 conference concluding speech, "People by the millions will die like flies," indeed must have been a troublesome vision. When President Smith told us of his vision, the U.S. and the USSR were allies. Some tiffs had occurred between the USSR and the U.S., but the idea that the Soviets would become an enemy wasn't popular. In 1946, the USA was the world's greatest military power. It seemed the allies of the U.S. succeeded in World War II because we had sent them material. The idea that the USSR would dwarf the U.S. military's might was contrary to any reasonable expectation. But today it is exactly true. The Soviets' military might is awesome. Nearly all of their population, including peasant farmers, serve in their reserves and may become part of their army in time of war. They have amassed a year's supply of food, including U.S. grain, so they will not have to farm the first year of any war. They have about 5 times as many fighter and several times as many modern bomber aircraft as we do. They are well-made, effective aircraft with well-trained pilots and crews. Their infantry's weapons and logistics preparations are staggering. Thus, 2 elements of President Smith's vision were exactly correct. The USSR became our enemy, and their military might dwarfs our own. It's no secret we have nuclear warhead missiles in Europe and underground silos here, but in 1946 nuclear missiles were beyond imagination. Even Massachusetts Institute of Technology's president in 1950 said, "Intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads are impossible," but we had them by 1963. I've worked in Minuteman missile silos, which accurately fits President Smith's description. But our cruise missiles were made after 1980. General Bernard Rogers, NATO commander, was so outspoken against the INF Treaty that he was removed. General John Gavins, his successor, said that he could not maintain Europe in a war for more than 2 weeks without nuclear weapons. So 5 more elements of President Smith's vision are verified. We have missiles in Europe and in silos that carry atomic bombs and are essential for U.S. defense. Next, President Smith said that he would withdraw our missiles from Europe to appease the Soviets. Former United Nations Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick said that the INF treaties hurts us militarily, but we have to do it. Dr. Eugene Callan says the treaty was politically motivated. Missiles were used as bargaining chips in negotiations with the Soviets, which is a form of appeasement, and President Reagan may have been buying time with their removal until other new systems were in place. During the negotiations, we revealed we knew the USSR plans to violate the treaty. Thus, two more elements of President Smith's vision are verified. On the 1st of September 88, the U.S. began removing missiles to comply with the treaty designed to appease the Soviets. By December 31st of 1989, our missiles should be disarmed. Just before President Smith visited us, the newspaper headlined a giant, about 24-wheel artillery piece named the atomic cannon. It was to have been like Big Bertha Germany used in Bader Liege, Namur, and Paris. The atomic cannon was designed to fire atomic bombs 100 miles to assure no potential aggressor ever would start another war. But President Smith said he did not see anything like that. History reveals the atomic cannon was a flop, and by about 1948 the program was cancelled. The U.S. has a howitzer able to fire a nuclear weapon about 20 miles, but it is very different from the Colossus shown in the news. Thus another element of President Smith's prophecy is verified. As predicted, all U.S. presidents have had North European or British ancestry. But in 1988, a man of Greek descent led the polls for a time. He may red again, thus one more element of President Smith's vision is realized. We see how another element could occur. The next elements in President Smith's prophecy were another great and terrible war. It would make World War II look like a training exercise, and people would die like flies. This obviously hasn't happened yet, but consider some of the Soviets' weapons and military preparations and the results of their use. The Soviets have 100 megaton hydrogen bombs which could be used against military bases and cities. Also, when the Soviets tested one of their first 100 megaton bombs, the electromagnetic pulse EMP, which is an incredibly high energy radio wave produced by the detonation, melted an electrical system power transformer's windings 190 miles away. The Soviets are far ahead of the US in space technology and the number of satellites in orbit. From January through September 1987, the Soviets fired more than 700 vehicles into space, mostly military. The US space program for that same time was almost stopped, and some military analysts believe some of the Soviets' satellites in orbit above the US contain high-yield nuclear bombs purposefully to destroy all transformers in the nationwide power grid, computers, radios, TVs, telephones, and most other electronic devices in the US pacemakers, and electronic watches may be blown out too. Most transistors, diodes, integrated circuits, and other semiconductor devices can tolerate less than 30 volts, but EMP is about a 50,000 volt/meter wave. Evacuation from cities before the bombs hit may be difficult, because new vehicle engines and alternators today have semiconductor controls. Their junctions could be melted in a millionth of a second by the EMP. It may be as if for an instant the entire continent were a microwave oven. Older vehicles with points in their distributors and mechanical voltage regulators may continue to operate if their alternator diodes are not blown. Diodes and electronic auto parts can be replaced if spares exist that were shielded. Amateur radio gear with electronic tubes may still work afterward, but well pumps that supply our drinking water may be out of service for a long time. The USSR's military buildup is not to protect their country from invasion. Who since Hitler has invaded the USSR? Instead, the USSR has been the aggressor in many wars throughout the world. Two reliable military sources have told me that on July 4th, 1987, a Soviet Bear bomber 2,000 miles from Hawaii fired an intermediate range missile at Hawaii. When it was about 100 miles from Honolulu, the U.S. had not destroyed it, and a Soviet aircraft that was there shot it down. The military information officer reported that when he revealed the story to the news media, the media managers refused to air it, saying it would be bad for business. Recent reports of Soviet landings on the Aleutian Islands and other places suggest they are practicing for an invasion. If the war President Smith saw occurs, conditions will be like our pre-1800s ancestors knew, with some shelters but few modern machines by which we work. Conditions will be worse for a long time. Government and major services, including police, electricity, potable and waste, fuel, and commercial food, medicines and clothes may not exist. Engines to power pumps, vehicles and machines may not work. 3 Nephi 21, verses 14 through 15, says that if the Gentiles don't repent, the Lord will destroy their chariots, cities, and strongholds. Our ancestors had wagons and horses for transportation and work. Shovels, hoes, seed, and bikes with puncture-resistant tubes may be scarce. There may be no food from farms other than than what will be carried. No manufactured goods or any safe drinking water. Our forebears knew how to do things without our machines that we do not know how to do. Thus, conditions could be exactly like President Smith described. The worst conditions of the Depression would seem like a Sunday school picnic in comparison. In about 1940, my parents started a Sunday evening study group with their friend Dr. Sidney B. Sperry taught. In about 1964, while studying the Doctrine and Covenants, Dr. Sperry noted section 1, verse 17, said a calamity would come upon the children of men. He told us of an experience he had with President George Albert Smith at the end of a conference. Dr. Sperry said, I rushed up onto the platform to speak with President Smith after the prayer. When I arrived at his side, he was standing, overlooking the congregation. The people were just starting to stand up, and the ushers were just starting to open the doors so they could leave. And I heard the president woefully mutter as he looked up at the congregation, they'll die like flies. Dr. Sperry explained his concern that President Smith looked at the saints and said, they'll die like flies. Neither my father, mother, nor I said anything to the group what President Smith told us in our home. Knowing President Smith considered saints would be among those whom he told us would die like flies greatly concerns me too. For I am one of them, and was in the tabernacle when that occurred. I went to conference in the tabernacle when I was young, and saw Dr. Sperry rush up to the speaker's platform at the end of a conference. Perhaps I feel like Laman felt about the Jews at Jerusalem being righteous, that many saints are honorable, diligent in the Lord's work, and doers of the word, not hearers only. Yet I know President Benson has said that the revelation on the production and storage of food may be as important to our temporal salvation as it was for Noah to get into the ark, and few have complied with its counsel of the Lord's living prophet. Remember the Lord said, If ye are prepared, ye shall not fear. Ancient prophets knew our day would be difficult, yet yearned to see it. The saints are commanded to obey and teach the Lord's laws, to multiply and fill the earth, and build the Lord's kingdom. Our task is not to shrink, but to prepare for challenges that may demand our greatest efforts to survive free from AIDS or plagues that otherwise might infect everyone. I record this as a witness of my friend and cousin, George Albert Smith's description of a prophetic vision he saw. I began writing it last September, and have remembered more as I concentrated on its comments. I've not recorded here all I now remember. See also President Smith's General Conference speeches. After reading my October 28th version, my brother Robert said he remembered President Smith's visit exactly as I wrote it, but doesn't remember some I since added. Alice said she remembered some of the December 23rd version. On December 18th, Dr. Nibley said his mother a close friend of President Smith, told him about the vision which President Smith received at a conference in the Bay Area and related it in his talk. Dr. Nibley also said he was close to LeGrand Richards' family, and Sister Richards told him about the vision too. Note: it should be noted that Brother Horn has since indicated that he may have gotten the word Greek wrong, but that the impression was that the president's ancestry was not your typical white European. Our very own Bob, here on the forum, has indicated that when he was a lad in Ogden, the word Greek was often a polite way to refer to someone who was black, instead of the common vulgar terms of that day. Account 3. Source unknown, but cited in an email that Dr. Jones from this forum received. If anyone has information as to the source of this account, I would greatly appreciate it. My father was one of the 3 men who started the church's roadshow drama program in the early years of the 20th century. Through that exposure to church leadership, he formed many lasting relationships which lasted all of his life. He eventually graduated from college with a master's degree, which is now equivalent to roughly Ph.D., and was widely used in the church's building program. Designing and building the first few church canneries. After his first wife died from what is just a minor medical problem these days, he went south to become the superintendent over the Civilian Conservation Corps (CCC) program that was started during the Depression to provide a jobs program for the destitute out-of-work men who comprised over 1/3 of the workforce. His gang built the Science Park tunnels and the bridge over the Virgin River between Hurricane and La Virgen, Utah, and then he left to work building projects for the church again. The canneries in Hurricane Kanab, St. George, and several others I will decline to mention in the interest of brevity. During his CCC days he married my mother, and they began their family. I only bring this history here to avow because it lays the foundation for what subsequently happened. After World War II, George Albert Smith was a regular visitor of our home in La Virgen. He always came with the church architects to have Dad go over plans for this building or that one, because Dad was extremely good at looking at blueprints and envisioning spatially what was being built, thus being able to see right offhand what many architects could not, even with their education. He was able to see if the building could even be built as drawn, and if not, what changes were needed to make it buildable. On one of these trips, President Smith drove down in the limited edition Lincoln Continental convertible Henry Ford had given to Heber J. Grant as president of the church. While he was there, Dad and the architects were in heads over coattails, discussing the plans of a proposed temple, and the discussion got so involved that George Albert was lost, and so he invited my oldest brother, who was then 11 going on 12, to go for a ride with him. During that ride, President Smith interviewed my brother and gave him quite a priesthood worthiness interview. He then got after him for being more interested in getting all of his friends in town to notice the fact that he was riding in a Lincoln Continental convertible with the top down than he was in conversing with the living prophet of God. At that point, President Smith quite abruptly stopped and turned in the seat so that he was facing my brother and related to him what sounds basically like the same vision that Brother David Horn related. Everything that my brother wrote down in his journal, which he didn't have until he got home, and told Mother what had happened. And she got him a journal and had him write down all that President Smith had told him. Everything that he wrote down correlates except that there is no mention of a Greek anything in the version my brother recorded. After reading Dreams and Visions, and reading that vision as related by Brother Horn, I asked my brother specifically if President Smith had said anything about a Greek president being the key event to watch for. And he tells me that nothing like that was mentioned. He just said that it would be a president of different extraction than the normal Northern European ancestry that we had had up to that point. However, President Smith did tell him to look specifically for the day when the American dollar was so worthless that no other country would allow payment in dollars, for that would signal the beginning of such a severe depression that only LDS people who had their food supplies and clothing supplies, and whatever they needed for heat and to cook with, would be able to survive. Then he stopped for a moment as though he was going inside himself, and then said that there would be other survivors, but they would only survive because they were the honest in heart, whom the Lord would miraculously bring to the saints to teach and nurture, and that their survival would be something truly spiritual to those of us who were prepared for the calamities that would befall the LDS people who were not prepared, and the unprepared LDS would be affected the worst and die the more agonizing deaths, because they had been warned and yet rejected those warnings. Number 1. Weapons would be taken from the populace. Advised to have weapons and ammo stashed where it would be unobservable, but which could be gotten to in a moment's notice. 2. Russia would appear to fall from its mighty position, but that would only be a ruse, because they would continue to only grow stronger because they would not have to support all of the poor countries they had taken over. Number 3. The U.S. would give up its strategic power base and become the scourge of the world because of the abuse of power they would leverage against all other lesser countries. And the other world powers would force the U.S. to take their bombs out of Europe. Doesn't remember anything being said about whether bombs were nuclear or not. Number 4. Missiles would be hidden in grain silos. Didn't weigh anything about them being the buried silos we all know. Number 5. Nations would move huge battle tanks around to where they needed them on trucks that are bigger than any you have ever seen up till now, in 1949. Number 6. Then a terrible war would break out that would pit the powerful nations of the world against the U.S., and that the U.S. would find out what it was like to have war waged in their backyards, and America would find out that World War II had merely been a training exercise. Number 7. The worst time in the Depression would look like a picnic in comparison. He then reiterated to him that he needed to put away guns and ammo where it could not be confiscated so that he could protect his family until he could get them to one of the refuges that the Lord would provide his worthy saints. After he got to the refuges, he would not need those weapons, but that perhaps his children and grandchildren would go fight for the Constitution. He then quit talking and refused to give any further clarifications. After recording what he could remember, my brother felt like he had left something important out, and was concerned. So since President Smith was still in residence, my brother went back to him and had him read what he had written. President Smith told him that he had all that needed to be recorded, and that he now felt he had overstepped his bounds in telling my brother all that he had, and prayed that the Lord would forgive him, and that my brother should only record and tell his family the elements that needed to be kept sacred in his journal. Various quotes. President George Albert Smith quotes from October 1946 General Conference. I fear that the time is coming, unless we can find some way not only to prevent the destruction of human life by careless accidents, but also unless we can call the people of this world to repent of their sins and turn from the error of their ways, that the great war that had just passed will be an insignificant thing, as far as calamity is concerned, compared to that which is before us. We are not out of the woods. This world is in for a house cleaning unless the sons and daughters of our Heavenly Father repent of their sins and turn to Him. And that means the Latter-day Saints, or the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, along with all the rest, but we, first of all, ought to be setting the example. President George Albert Smith from April 1950 General Conference. It will not be long until calamities will overtake the human family, unless there is a speedy repentance. It will not be long before those who are scattered over the face of the earth by millions will die like flies because of what will come. Elder Bruce R. McConkie gave a supporting address in the April 1979 General Conference. We do not say that all of the saints will be spared and saved from the coming day of desolation, but we do say there is no promise of safety and no promise of security except for those who love the Lord and who are seeking to do all that He commands. It may be, for instance, that nothing except the power of faith and the authority of the priesthood can save individuals and congregations from the atomic holocausts that surely shall be. And so we raise the warning voice and say, take heed, prepare, watch, and be ready. There is no security in any course except the course of obedience and conformity and righteousness. This other post can be found on the 5th page and also the 6th page of the Ultimate George Albert Smith Prophecy thread. I should start off by telling everyone that I attended university with one of David Horne's sons, the year David typed up his memories of his great-uncle George Albert Smith's visit to their family home evening when he was a boy. David is very intelligent, and so is his son. I had the opportunity to meet David and the rest of his family back in 1991. He's a little quirky, but I felt a strong impression while getting to know him that President Smith did indeed visit his family and did indeed have a vision about coming events. I believe time has caused details of that vision that was told by President Smith to become blurred and vague in his mind to some extent, but as a whole, the main details are accurate. I had the chance to message David's son a few months before the presidential election. I was really concerned that Hillary would get elected and would have us go to war with Russia. As you may remember, Putin called all Russian delegates home right before the election. Asked David's son regarding any updates of what his dad remembered. He said that he, speaking of himself, wasn't 100% sure about what Greek extract was supposed to mean. It could mean that either the president had Greek ancestry, or it could mean that the president just wasn't of Northern European descent or British descent. However, more importantly, he said his dad remembered that before this great attack, the Russians would demand that we give Alaska back to them. He also said that there were a few other things his dad remembered, but would not reveal. So there's the litmus test. If Russia demands Alaska back, then you can be sure that the events that David Horne heard from President Smith will shortly come to pass. On that note, for anyone who is interested, please research all of the petroleum pipelines that feed Europe and see how many of them now traverse Russian-controlled territory. It's been said that if petroleum supplies were cut off to Europe, that they would only have about 2 weeks' supply. This fact helps make sense just why Russia invaded Ukraine and the Crimea Peninsula. This may be a bit off topic, but with all the changes that have come about recently in the church, only one has concerned me. That's being reducing church time to 2 hours and making the gospel home based and church supported. I feel this may be the Lord's preparing his saints for some future date when proselyting is banned in the United States and elsewhere. It already is in Russia. Assembling in meeting houses and temples might also be banned. The Lord has always given the saints forewarning and helped prepare them for major calamities. Just look at the proclamation to the world on the family that came out in 1995. When it was published, I thought that it was redundant to the general public consensus. I would never have dreamed that the family would be attacked the way it has been since that time, and still is. As far as the prophecy of George Albert Smith is concerned, be assured that the Lord will forewarn and prepare the obedience before that day, so that the majority of them will be in a place of safety when those events unfold. Okay, now that I've read the different accounts, it's probably a good time to start talking about if there's any merit to this. And I would argue yes. And the main reason why I believe in this prophecy comes down to this statement, which reads, "However, President Smith did tell him to look specifically for the day when the American dollar was so worthless that no other country would allow payment in dollars, for that would signal the beginning of such a severe depression that only LDS people who had their food supplies and clothing supplies, and whatever they needed for heat to cook with would be able to survive." Now, you can actually look at the charts at the bottom of the screen. I've got two of them. And they're practically the same thing, just given different metrics. One's a bar graph and another's a line graph. But it's basically showing the inflation of, at least the first chart is showing the inflation over every year. That's what each single bar represents, is the inflation rate of that year. And on the line graph, it's showing the buying power of the American dollar. And looking at these graphs, like here's a very simple question: is what's the chances of the dollar, the buying power of the dollar going up? Just looking at these graphs, and then what's the chances of it going down? And it should be a pretty easy answer, is that we've had such a downward trend for as long as the American dollar, or as long as the Federal Reserve was created. The only times that we were actually getting back purchasing power was from around 1919 to 1947. After that, it's just a downward trend. Inflation just keeps going up and up every year. So, and the reason why is it comes down to reckless government spending and the Federal Reserve printing money over and over again. So every time the government can't, doesn't have the money to pay for its expenses every year, and this happens pretty much every year, they have to ask the Federal Reserve to create some currency so they could pay back their debts. So then the Federal Reserve will do this, and then they'll give it to the American government. But it comes at the cost that it puts the U.S. in even more debt, which accumulates every year, especially with interest. And it's just this vicious cycle of having to print money because the U.S. government can't pay its expenses, and then we always overspend, and we keep getting into more debt, and it's just a very, very vicious cycle. I was thinking I would, originally I was planning on explaining this in a lot better detail, but I decided it's probably worth its own video. So, you should definitely research inflation on your own if you have no idea about it, but I can tell you that you don't need this prophecy to know that the American dollar is eventually going to become worthless, right? That's a given if you know what I'm talking about. So perhaps I'll make a more detailed video about inflation and why the US dollar is pretty much going to be worthless at some point in the future. So continuing, another question we have to ask is, well, when would this attack potentially happen? And we do get a few important hints. So let me read them. Until then, all the presidents would be of British or Northern European ancestry. President Smith indicated that this attack would take place on a holiday after the presidential election, but before the official inauguration. He said that the president at this time would be of Greek ancestry. Our very own Bob here on the forum has indicated that when he was a lad in Ogden, the word Greek was often a polite way to refer to someone who was black, instead of the common, vulgar terms of that day. So, in other words, he's pretty much saying that this president would be black, would have no British or Northern European ancestry in their lineage, and that this would happen before the official inauguration, which is kind of interesting. And then lastly, we also have weapons would be taken away from the populace. advised to have weapons and ammo stashed where it would be unobservable, but which could be gotten to in a moment's notice. Now, considering that the Democratic Party is anti-gun, well, I could only assume that this president would, well, be a Democrat. So, on this slide, I've got Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris's portraits, and I've got 4 question marks. Now, in a previous video, I did say that I thought that Kamala Harris would be put into office, and part of that is because I find it would be a miracle if Joe Biden could last his entire term, to be completely honest. But if we're looking at and this is assuming that Kamala Harris gets put into office, is she hardly has any Northern European ancestry in her lineage. Barack Obama actually did have a lot of Northern European ancestors, but Kamala Harris doesn't have a whole lot. She still has some, but she's mostly from, if I remember correctly, South Africa, Jamaica, something like that. And most of her ancestry comes from other places. So, that's one potential factor. 2, she is black, so if Greek was a polite way to refer to black, then perhaps President Smith was really saying, oh, this president would be black. And that's a very, that's another factor to keep in mind. And what was the other thing? Oh yeah, and then weapons would be taken away from the populace. That would probably happen, while a Democratic president was in office. Or perhaps maybe if the Democrats had just a majority in both the Senate and Congress. So, as you can see, Kamala Harris seems to be a very reasonable assumption. Now, do keep in mind, I am making an assumption that Kamala Harris would get into office. I don't know if that actually would end up happening. But if she ends up getting into office, I would not be surprised if she might be the president for when this attack would possibly happen. I also have the other question marks, and I've gotten a couple of things written down. So remember from the previous videos, we have 2 feathers that are eaten up in Ezra's vision, and then we have 3 kings subdued in Daniel's vision. So perhaps, so it's basically saying that the last 2 feathers, the last 2 question marks on the slide here, do not get a chance to reign. So perhaps this attack could happen even later, maybe. And let's just assume Kamala Harris gets into office. Perhaps it might happen while Kamala Harris is in office, or perhaps it might happen with someone else who comes even later. It's too early to call exactly when this is going to happen, on what president it's going to land on. It's like hot potato. But it's just too early to call it. We don't know enough about what the future holds. But this could give us an idea of who or what the eagle heads might be. So, in the Ezra's eagle vision, the 3 heads represent different kings or kingdoms. And then remember, in Daniel's vision, the beast was an amalgamation of the 3 previous beasts and kings. So there is a possibility that the heads might be representing rulers from foreign powers. And then that's where the George Albert Smith prophecy comes into play, because that would explain or predict how the United States would end up being subdued, so to speak, and be brought under rule from foreign nations. And perhaps, maybe, and this is kind of speculatory, but perhaps maybe at the end of this World War, we have America split up into 3 different parts, and maybe you have one foreign nation who takes control of one section, you have another nation who takes control of another section, and then you have a third taking up the last 3 sections. It does say in that vision, when it's describing what the 3 heads are, that they represent 3 different kingdoms. So perhaps the United States is broken up into different, like, own kingdoms that are ruled by foreign powers. So that is one very likely possibility. Then it would also make sense why the heads end up fighting each other, because they want to take control of the other 2 heads, right? The other kingdoms. So those are my thoughts on how the George Albert Smith prophecy could very easily potentially relate to Ezra's eagle. There is the possibility that maybe somehow the Smith's prophecy isn't actually true, which I would be surprised if it wasn't. But it is something very noteworthy to keep in mind as we're looking at the different prophecies. So that's going to be it for the video. As a disclaimer, my views are not representative of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm not a prophet, I don't have that authority, and while I do believe in the things I've talked about in this video series, at the end of the day, it is speculation. Keep that in mind, come to your own conclusions, do your own research, and yeah, that's going to be it. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys learned something from this. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys next time.